President Trump prepares to welcome Ukraine's Vladimir Zelensky back to Washington on Friday, while taking a Thursday phone call from Russia's Vladimir Putin, amid debate on whether the U.S. might soon send long range Tomahawk cruise missiles to the Ukrainian defenders.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We're joined today by my colleagues, editorial board members Kate Odell and Jillian Melcher. Fresh off his return from the Middle East, touting his Gaza ceasefire deal, is President Trump now ready to apply those lessons about hard power to Russia's invasion of Ukraine? That's what the world might be about to find out here as we tape this on Thursday afternoon. President Trump is having a phone call with President Putin. Here is the Truth Social post. I am speaking to President Putin now. The conversation is ongoing, a lengthy one, and I will report the contents, as will President Putin, at its conclusion, unquote. Then tomorrow, on Friday, Ukrainian President Zelensky is scheduled to visit Washington to see Trump. Some reports saying he'll also have meetings on Capitol Hill and with U.S. defense companies. Amid this this rhetorical turn by the president away from Putin and towards Zelensky. Let's listen to this on Sunday. This is Trump on Air Force One.
They need Patriots very badly. They'd like to have Tomahawks. That's a step up. They'd like to have Tomahawks. We talked about that. And so we'll see. Well, I don't know. I might have to speak to Russia, to be honest with you, about Tomahawks. Do they want to have Tomahawks going in their direction? I don't think so. I think I might speak to Russia about that, in all fairness. I told that to President Zelensky because Tomahawks are a new step of aggression. But you understand that very well.
Are you saying that you will speak to Putin first about Tomahawks?
I might talk to him. I might say, look, if this war's not going to get settled, I'm going to send them Tomahawks. I may send that. The Tomahawk is an incredible weapon, a very offensive weapon. And honestly, Russia does not need that. They don't need that. Yeah, I may tell them that if the war is not settled, that we may very well do it. We may not, but we may do it. I think it's appropriate to bring up. Yeah.
Kate, the Journal's editorial on Thursday is under the headline, Trump's Gaza Lessons for Ukraine. And obviously there are differences between what's happening in the Middle East and what's happening in Europe. But what are the parallels that you see?
Well, I think, as Ukraine's Zelensky comes to Washington on Friday, there's a lot of question about whether Trump will take this opportunity that he has to use some of what he has gained from his victory in the Middle East this week and apply the same logic to Ukraine. And so to think about the parallels, let's set the table a little bit. The president has this triumphant hostage deal this week in the Middle East that defied a lot of conventional expectations about what he could accomplish there. It's been a good week for Trump, and his perception as a strong leader, and also for the world's larger view that the U.S. is an indispensable power and a determiner of events. And so what produced that deal? I think it's pretty clear that the elements of Trump's strategy were he forced Hamas to understand that they would pay a price if they didn't negotiate. He backed Israel to the hilt and Netanyahu. He didn't indulge outrageous false moral equivalences about why the war started or its causes. And then finally, I think an element of that strategy too was he really understood that the primacy of the battlefield in settling the war, that Israel had to accomplish military objectives on the ground if it wanted to command leverage at a negotiating table and if it wanted to produce a lasting peace. So all of those lessons are highly relevant in Ukraine. And also, so the real question, the real thing to watch on Friday is a lot of discussion about Tomahawks now, but are Tomahawks going to be the start of a larger turn and him taking this fresh political capital he has and driving a hard bargain with Putin?
Jillian, it does seem like the president's rhetoric has shifted, has hardened toward Putin in recent weeks, including that Truth Social post late last month where he suggested Russia is a paper tiger and that Ukraine might even be able to take back their country in its original form, and who knows, maybe even go further than that. unquote. Interestingly, Zelensky told an interviewer that he was even surprised a little bit to hear the president say that on that Truth Social post. But I do agree that part of what we are waiting to see is whether that rhetoric now will be matched up by increased action from Washington and from President Trump.
Yeah, I think that Trump's now, he claimed this as a signature issue. He says a lot that the war wouldn't have started if he'd been president and not Biden. But he is trying to portray himself as the peacemaking president. And that means that the outcome of this war will affect his legacy. And I think that, he's done a lot of outreach to Putin so far, given him a lot of chances to sit down and negotiate. And Putin has proven completely intransigent. I mean, I'm thinking of another tweet or another Truth Social post where Trump was saying, we have these great conversations. And then I get off the phone and my wife says, hey, they just bombed another city. And so I think that's kind of been how it's gone so far. Nobody can say that Trump hasn't given Putin a chance to negotiate. But the question is, if Putin's not willing to stop the war, what is the U.S. going to do about it? And I think to Kate's point, it needs to increase U.S. leverage and Ukrainian leverage. And one way to do that is putting the pressure on Russia.
Kate, the conversation now is over these Tomahawk cruise missiles. Give us a sense of what kind of power the Tomahawks might bring to bear and how much that would help Ukraine's defenders on the front lines.
Yeah, to that point, I think the public largely supports helping Ukraine, but they want to know what the end game is and how they're going to use some of these weapons to get more leverage and to win the war. And what's the strategy? I think that was a critique that was out there during the Biden administration. And so I would say the Tomahawk moment is actually a very important one. Tomahawk cruise missiles are a premier U.S. weapon with an unclassified range of about 1,000 miles. I mean, some of the long-range missiles we've been advocating to give Ukraine, the Army's tactical missile system, we're talking about 190 miles. I mean, that's the magnitude of difference that we're discussing. And the accuracy of the Tomahawk is sort of wild. The United States launched about 30 Tomahawks during the Iran attack from submarines, and the president said that they came within 9 inches of their target. So this is a devastating weapon. But more than that, more than just kind of rehearsing some of those specifications, I mentioned that because the Tomahawks could, if paired with a strategy, they really could be an opportunity for Ukraine to go on offense and go after some of the things that allow Russia to continue prosecuting the war. Right now, Ukraine's been stuck, trying to take down incoming projectiles, do a lot of air defense, basically just hold the front line, not let the Russians gain very much. Well, the point of the Tomahawk is that instead of shooting down drones, you launch a Tomahawk at the Shahed Iranian drone production facility, and you keep Russia from being able to menace Ukraine with, thousands and thousands of drones. So the Tomahawk really has the potential to be significant in helping Ukraine get the momentum back that translates to leverage for a settlement to end the war.
And also, it seems like it might be a way of ending the asymmetry because the Ukraine has had restrictions on its use of U.S.-provided weapons to strike into Russian territory. And at the same time, Jillian, the Russian forces are all the time taking aim at Ukraine's industrial defense companies, its supply lines. You were recently on a trip to eastern Ukraine, Donetsk. The headline on your most recent piece is Ukraine at the Rubicon. And one of my takeaways from that was that Russia's strategy is to put pressure on the troops at the front lines by squeezing what's happening behind the front lines. Give us a sense of what you saw there.
Yeah, so the key thing to understand about the region that I visited is Donetsk is sort of the fortress that is keeping the barbarians at bay. So it's a 31-mile stretch that goes down. Ukraine has been fortifying this fortress belt for the past 10 or more years. It's really sturdy, and it's stopped the Russians from rolling further into Ukraine. So the Russians have hit themselves against this. Every time they do it, they end up losing tanks, they end up losing people. And so they kind of had to shift their strategy. So what they're doing on a ground level is they're trying to strike Ukrainian logistics. It's an interdiction campaign. And the idea is that if you can weaken Ukrainians at the front by cutting off their supplies, their ammunition, their ability to conduct rotations, their ability to do evacuations if people are wounded, that you're going to put a lot more strain on those frontline troops. And at the same time, the Russians are sending small groups of people across, trying to do these tiny advances where most of the Russians that cross end up getting killed. But if 2 or 3 of them make it a little bit further, they can wait for reinforcements. So that's kind of the dynamic. It's a shifting strategy there, but they're conducting an interdiction campaign. And one thing to take away from that is the strength of the fortress belt and how well the Ukrainians have held the front line there. Now, the Russians are kind of trying to adapt. They're seeing what Ukraine is doing with drone warfare and how creatively they've used it. And they're pouring a lot of resources into this. And so that's enabling their interdiction campaign. But I think to Kate's point, starting to hit Russian logistics, doing the same thing to the Russians that they are trying to do to Ukraine, but doing it even deeper. The metaphor that gets thrown around a lot is that it's inefficient to try to take down arrows. It's better to try to take out the archer. And you are actually seeing Ukraine do a long-range strike campaign. You know, there aren't the same restrictions on weapons that Ukraine produces indigenously. So it's ramping up production of long-range drones. It recently announced that it's got its first cruise missile, which is pretty long range and a pretty heavy payload. And you've seen that campaign intensify in recent months. You know, I was hearing between August and September, they've done about 85 strikes on targets in Russia. Some of them are energy targets, but some of them are also Russian defense industrial targets. And I think that the Trump administration has an opportunity here to really throw its weight behind that campaign and amplify it. You're already seeing the U.S. providing some intelligence that's enabling that, but Tomahawks would send a message that we support this, that unlike under the Biden administration, the U.S. isn't afraid to let Ukraine hit back and fight with that one hand tied behind its back.
The Journal had an op-ed this week by a couple of defense experts, Seth Jones and Tom Caracco, and here's part of what they write. There are roughly 2,000 Russian military targets within range of the 1,500-mile variant of the Tomahawk, and more than 1,600 targets within range of the 1,000-mile variant. Russia's Shahed drone factory in Yelabuga would be in the shorter range, unquote. Kate, I mean, is the argument that is happening inside the Pentagon and inside the Trump administration about whether that would be escalatory to send those kinds of long-range weapons that Ukraine would use to hit inside Russian territory? And what's your view of that debate? I mean, I seem to remember worries that it would be escalatory to give Ukraine F-16s, which NATO and the U.S. allied countries have now done. I remember conversations about whether it would be escalatory to send tanks off to Ukraine, which is now long in the rearview mirror.
Yeah, I do think escalation is driving a lot of the discussion around Tomahawks. And it's not, the odd thing is that it is similar to the Biden administration that did fear escalation every time they handed Ukraine a new weapon system. I would say a few things about the escalation risks, because it is a potent argument, and it's a place where people say, well, that's very different from what you described in the Middle East, because Russia is a nuclear power and you're driving us to the brink with them. So quick things on that would be, I mean, first of all, Russia is launching ballistic and cruise missiles at Ukraine nearly every night. So return fire is not an escalation, not introducing anything that the Russians haven't introduced themselves. The second is your point about the empirical record, which is that Russia has used nuclear blackmail against the United States for 3 years to try to talk us out of sending everything from F-16s to long-range army missiles, even about Patriot air defense systems. And so you have to price in the fact that they have made these threats before and have not escalated. And then another point would be that there are risks of not sending Tomahawks that are often not appreciated in this conversation. There are risks of NATO doing nothing as Putin essentially escalates with Europe. I mean, Putin's drone incursion into Poland, sending 19 drones into Poland, a little fighter jet visit from over Estonia. Putin has not really paid much of a price for those incursions. He seems to be escalating himself. And I think inaction presents just a very underappreciated risk here of bringing us closer to the brink of conflict. Sometimes, a tough message like Tomahawks is actually a force for peace and de-escalation. And I think that would be the case here.
One point that I find persuasive is just thinking about what the alternatives are. and what they were. So to go back to Trump's apparently hardening stance on this, here's something that he said on Tuesday. He said, "I have to tell you, I give credit because who would think that Ukraine could have fought Russia for 4 years to essentially a standstill," unquote. And Jillian, I mean, that didn't happen by accident. The weapons that have been provided by the U.S. and the West was a big part of making sure that Ukraine was able to fight to a standstill. And what was the alternative? I mean, obviously, the intelligence about the Ukrainian collapse that was expected by the Biden administration was not correct. But there's an alternative scenario where the West and the U.S. did not act to provide any of these systems that are now protecting Ukrainian cities, protecting its defense industry, and Russia does overrun Kyiv. And is that a world that is better or worse for NATO? And I can only come to the conclusion, Jillian, that that's a much more dangerous world for the U.S. and NATO to be in. And if that's the conclusion of that thought experiment, then how does that affect the U.S. and President Trump's behavior going forward?
Yeah, you're absolutely right on that. When I'm talking to Ukrainians, a lot of them point to Georgia and note that in 2008, Russia did aggression there and it went pretty much unpunished. Then you had 2014, where Russia was invading eastern Ukraine in conjunction with separatists that it backed. Not a lot of consequences there. And they think that that emboldened Russia to launch the full-scale invasion in 2022. Now, what you're seeing now is similar rhetoric, similar threats against Moldova, which is not a NATO member, but also against the Baltic states, which are NATO members. So I think the conclusion from that is that if Russian aggression isn't checked, it will continue. And I think we're very lucky to have the Ukrainians take the stand that they did. To Kate's point, just about the consequences of inaction, I think one thing that's made an impression on me is talking to Ukrainian prisoners of war, and a lot of them have endured really horrific things in Russian captivity, or talking to people who lived under Russian occupation. And the calculus that they are making is, if you look at the brutality of Russians, they are more afraid of Russian control and Russian domination than they are of nukes. Like, that's something that people have said to me. Now, that's not something to take lightly, that the nuclear threat isn't real, but I think Ukrainians have tested it. And one way that they tested it was with the incursion into Kursk. You saw a non-nuclear country taking territory in a nuclear country, and they basically called Putin's bluff on the nuclear threat. Another example of that is the long-range strikes that Ukraine is conducting into Russia right now using indigenous weapons. It's been a pretty sustained campaign. And you hear Putin making a lot of nuclear saber rattling, trying to threaten the West. But I think the Ukrainians have tested this, and Putin's tried to use the nukes as a deterrent. But when push comes to shove, when the Ukrainians test him on it, he hasn't been willing to use them.
Another piece of the U.S. aid picture, though it is less visible maybe than this discussion about Tomahawks, is sharing of intelligence. Kate, notable in early October, the Journal reported this: the U.S. will provide Ukraine with intelligence for long-range missile strikes on Russia's energy infrastructure, American officials said. I mean, that is an example of President Trump changing policy and doing something tangible to match the strengthening of his rhetoric here. A report then from the Hudson Institute saying that Russia had been putting protective structures over some of its energy facilities. And so, Kate, what is the importance of that intel sharing in your mind? I mean, not only if Ukraine can knock some of those energy facilities offline, it creates domestic troubles potentially for Putin, makes it harder to send fuel to the front lines, gasoline and diesel to the Russian war machine, but then also any attention and any resources that are diverted to trying to protect those facilities are not going toward trying to push the Ukrainian defenders back.
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously that energy infrastructure campaign has been having an effect for all the reasons you describe about you can see shortages and see the Russians try to take steps to prevent those attacks from happening. I will say, though, that given how dug in Putin appears to be in recalcitrant to negotiate an end to the war, the United States is going to have to be willing to give help to strike other types of legitimate military targets too. I mean, that's why the Shahed drone production facility we've been talking about here and the Tomahawk range is so crucial, because you have to change Putin's calculus that he's going to be able to carry on the war at a reasonable cost. And you can argue about Trump's strategy so far about he basically tried to listen to Putin, tried to talk to him, and maybe he had to run all those traps to get to a tougher stance. But it's now made it more challenging for the president, because it's going to take more action to persuade Putin that he's very serious about driving a hard bargain and bringing Putin to the table. And so I'm hoping that the energy infrastructure attacks are an important prelude, but it's obviously going to take a more expanded campaign to get Putin to come to the table and to change that battlefield picture.
Jillian, we'll give you the last word, but what else do you suppose is in the mix as President Zelensky comes to Washington, meets with President Trump? Obviously, the Tomahawk conversation is getting a lot of attention in the press and will probably be top of mind. But what else do you suppose Zelensky is seeking? What other aid could the U.S. provide that could make a difference on the ground, and might be asks where Zelensky can get Trump to yes?
Yeah, so that sanctions bill is one of them. The Ukrainians really want secondary sanctions targeting Russian oil, because that is what is funding Putin's war machine, and it's showing some signs of strain. So that's an important one. You've also got Russian assets. I think it's about 300 billion of them in the West. Take those, make Putin pay a price, and better yet, hand it over to Ukraine to help with their domestic weapons production. That's something that could send a really strong message. And also, to that point, I think there's a lot of opportunity here for Ukrainian cooperation with the West. Some of Putin's escalations with drones against Europe, I think, has made the West realize that this isn't just a threat that Ukraine faces. It's a threat that the West more broadly faces. And right now, there are two countries in the world that have experience with where this cutting edge, incredibly rapid drone warfare development is going, and that's Russia and Ukraine. And the Ukrainians are willing to work with the US, willing to work with Europe on drone defense. And I think there's a real opportunity here where the Ukrainians bring expertise, the West brings money, potentially does some components of building and developing these weapons outside of Ukraine, which would give Ukraine a sanctuary for once. So those are things that I'd expect to come up in this conversation.
Thank you, Jillian and Kate. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back tomorrow with another edition of Potomac Watch.